I just was really inspired by open primaries, and I felt that it was a missing piece. It was the first step that we could take in Oklahoma that would really crack things open.
This work has been going on in Oregon since the early 2000s, so I'm so honored and humbled to be building off of the work of many courageous leaders in Oregon.
We have a bright red state. 50% of the voters get absolute power. The rest of the voters have no chance to get anybody elected as an independent or a Democrat. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, but I want to see the Republican Party have to fight harder to get people elected.
If you look at the history of Arizona, whether it's John McCain, we could say Kyrsten Sinema now, though that might upset some people, but we tend to elect people who want to cross the aisle at least once in a while to solve problems. And the way the system is set up now, that's much more difficult to do.
I think the caliber of leaders, hundreds of people all over the country who are building and creating new campaigns and initiatives, is absolutely top-notch. Thank you, everybody, for joining today and taking some time out of your day. I've been actually looking forward to this discussion for the entire week, and let me tell you why. We, for many years, actually, we've been saying that we have to build a movement to reform the primary system. If we're going to have any shot at repealing closed primaries, at wresting control of the primaries from the political parties, we have to build a movement. And I frequently like to kind of ask myself and ask our team, how are we doing on that? And certainly there's a lot of different ways to look at that. One way is the press. I mean, the issue of open primaries is now talked about on a daily basis in newspapers and television news channels all over the country. There's been a major influx of investment, and certainly a particular shout out to Unite America and Catherine Gale and her team at the Institute for Political Innovation. They have done a brilliant job at engaging with the business community and organizing them around investing, not just in candidates and winners and losers, but in changing the rules of the game. And I think a third way, and this is something that to me is very close to my heart, is the people, the leadership. That's at the heart of building a movement. And I'm part of why I was so excited about this conversation today is that I think the caliber of leaders, not just the four that we have on the discussion today, but hundreds of people all over the country who are building and creating new campaigns and initiatives, is absolutely top-notch. And I'm very eager for all of you as members of our national open primaries community to get to know four just exceptional leaders. We're joined today by Margaret Kobos from Oklahoma United for Progress, by Michael Calcagno from All Oregon Votes, Joe Kirby from South Dakota Open Primaries, and Steve Goldstein from Save Democracy Arizona. All four of them are leaders in growing coalitions working in their states to reform the primary system. And we're going to spend a few minutes talking about what they're doing and how they're seeing things and what's going on locally. So welcome, all four of you. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks, John.
So let me open it up here and just each of you say, and keep it brief, 1 or 2 minutes. How did you personally come to this issue of primary reform, and why is it so important as for your state, given the political dynamics in your particular state? And Margaret, why don't we start with you, then we'll go to Michael, Joe, and with Steve.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It's extraordinary to be on this call today because probably two years ago is just when I founded Oklahoma United for Progress. And I did it in part because I was doing research and listening to your virtual meetings, your discussions, and did that all through, I've done as many as I can. And I just was really inspired by open primaries. And I felt that it was a missing piece. It was the first step that we could take in Oklahoma that would really crack things open. And it might be the only step. I mean, like, I just don't know where we might go after this, but our intention is to start with an open primary system that allows everybody the opportunity to vote in elections they pay for. And in Oklahoma, when I realized, I'm just a normal person, and I think I'm pretty typical in Oklahoma, just doing my work, raising my family, not really thinking about elections. And when I started looking at the way our system is set up here in Oklahoma, and that even though we are perceived as, fire engine red, only 50% of Oklahomans are registered Republican. Of all of the legislative and the top leadership positions in Oklahoma on our November 22 ballot, every single one went to a Republican candidate. Now, I'm a registered Republican, and when I saw that 50% of us were not being represented, I felt like that could explain a lot of the issues that we are having in government and the lack of forward progress on solutions. And so I really felt like we deserve better. I wanted to try to make that happen. And so we're just collecting. We're collecting people in the middle like me who want nonpartisan / bipartisan progress and solutions that can make Oklahoma, put us at least in the middle of the pack instead of the tail on the dog. So we have the lowest voter participation in the country. And so we just want to start with that and get people more aware, more educated, more inclined, and, just feeling like there's a positive future for all of us here in this state.
Michael?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to all of the fellow panelists here today and the audience for sharing your time with us to support this mission and this message. So my name is Michael, and I lead a group in Oregon called All Oregon Votes. And I really got into this work in 2015 when I was first elected to serve in local office on the community college school board. And that's a nonpartisan office, but I really came to realize the nationalization of politics was harming policymaking at the local level. So we were injecting national political narratives, and a lot of the outrage culture of the time was coming into and derailing solutions at the local level. And that was really disheartening to experience as a young person on a school board trying to be a volunteer elected official to help my community. I then went to go work for the Secretary of State in Salem at our state capitol. And that was around the time that Oregon was implementing a pioneering system of automatic voter registration through our DMV. Right. And it's a good system to automatically register folks to vote. But unfortunately, by default, it disenfranchises folks in closed primary elections. So it's an inbuilt mechanism of electoral exclusion. We're adding people to our voter registration totals, but we're automatically excluding them from full participation.
Right, because most of them are registering as independents and they can't vote.
That's right. And what it's created is an outcome where less than 1/3 of Oregon voters have any influence on which candidates are emerging from the closed partisan primary elections. And so this work has been going on in Oregon since the early 2000s. So I'm so honored and humbled to be building off of the work of many courageous leaders in Oregon, like our former Secretary of State, Phil Kiesling. So this has been a question that's been asked before in Oregon, and we have a novel approach that we're so excited about for an initiative petition that's coming up in November of 2024.
And I want to ask you about that novel approach, but I'm going to come back to that in a little bit.
Sure.
So take that for Joe, introduce yourself.
John, Joe Kirby, South Dakota. We started open primaries South Dakota. We've been actually trying for several years to get open primaries in South Dakota. Listening to Margaret, it sounds like Oklahoma and South Dakota's are kids from a different mother or something, because we have the same problem. We have a bright red state, 50% of the voters get absolute power. The rest of the voters have no chance to get anybody elected as an independent or a Democrat. And it's not fair. We need to do something about that. And the result is a lack of competition for ideas. We're a very stale state. Ideas are not, new ideas are not welcome. I'd like to see that change. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Republican, but I want to see the Republican Party have to fight harder to get people elected.
It's interesting.
We've been working on this for several years. Interestingly, this year we're starting to get a lot of mainstream Republicans on our side. Quietly, they don't want to be known as election reform advocates, but the crazies on the right are a real threat to the Republican Party generally. They're seeing that. So we've got our congressman, we've got a bunch of other politicians saying, we hope you succeed.
That's great. Steve?
Yeah, John, I'm with Save Democracy Arizona, and I come to this advocacy in a very different way. I worked in public broadcasting for 25 years and gave up that career because I wanted to advocate for something important. And I interviewed politicians of all stripes over many years, saw the disconnect, I would say, between what voters were believing and how, for example, our legislature was carrying things out. We were seeing very close margins, but they were leaning in such a way that the general electorate didn't seem to appreciate. And part of that developed from the fact that Arizona, I would say, to use the word pioneer, was a pioneer in the sense of how many of our voters registered as independents. It has been almost a third for more than a decade in Arizona.
Wow.
And the way the system is set up there, yes, independents can technically vote in our primary system, but they have to request either a Republican or Democratic ballot. So it's not truly open in that sense. And we are seeing a state that battleground, purple, whatever you want to call it, it certainly does fit that way. It is probably still a Republican-leaning state, but not in a conservative sense. And there are a lot of people here who really want to see a change, essentially because we want more problem solving. If you look at the history of Arizona, whether it's John McCain, we could say Kyrsten Sinema now, though that might upset some people, but we tend to elect people who want to cross the aisle at least once in a while to solve problems. And the way the system is set up now, that's much more difficult to do. So that's part of my passion for it, is to see, can we make it so it is as equal a system as we can have these days by giving independents a true voice.
That's great. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. Now, one of the things I find so interesting and exciting is that you're all pursuing different solutions in your state. I know Margaret and Joe are looking at top 2 nonpartisan primaries for South Dakota and Oklahoma. Michael, you're pursuing this novel constitutional approach, which I want you to talk about. I'm not going to try to summarize it. I know, Steve, you and the Save Democracy team are looking at Final 5 voting for Arizona, which combines open primaries with ranked choice voting. Talk briefly about that process of kind of figuring out what's the policy that works for your state, and what that's been like, and bring us in on that process. No order. I'm going to do some anarchy. You guys.
Hey, Margaret, you want to go first?
Yeah,
I
can't
unmuted.
wait.
Okay.
I can't wait. So we actually have not completely settled on a top 2 nonpartisan primary, but that is a system that I personally think works well. It works in our 2 major metropolitan areas, Tulsa and Oklahoma City, with great results and really high satisfaction with voters. And so people are familiar with that. I like it. I think it could solve a lot of problems and save money, which is kind of like my little Republican thing here. I'm always wanting to save some taxpayer money. So I think that's a great idea for us. I think that, we may see, we're creating a poll right now. We have a stakeholder who is helping us work out a fresh look at what do the citizens of Oklahoma really want and what would they tolerate, in an ideal world. So we are going to be doing that poll pretty soon. And that's going to give us a lot. And, John and Jeremy, both at Open Primaries, have told us over and over, it really does need to be from the ground up. And our contacts in the legislature and our community people all are in agreement with that. We're very kind of grassroots in that way. We want to know what works for the people, and that's what we're going to pursue.
Great.
South Dakota, we feel our hands are tied by a single subject rule in our Constitution. While many of us are drawn to the combined open primaries, ranked choice voting model of Alaska, we think we're going to take what we can get. And we think the table is set now for us to do a top 2 open primary. Public generally seems to understand it, and we're keeping it simple.
And when Joe, single subject rule, meaning that the courts have been very narrow in what you can put together on a ballot?
Yeah, they threw out a marijuana initiative that passed. The people supported it, and it covered both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana, and they threw that out as being 2 topics. So we want to be very cautious and not be susceptible to that kind of attack after we succeed.
That's smart.
Do you mind me asking, Joe, what's your timeline on that? Where are you in the process?
Our wording has been through our Legislative Research Council. Now it's at the Attorney General's office. We're going to be doing a petition drive in 2023. We have to file it a year in advance of the election, so we have to get all our signatures filed by November of 2023, and we will have the voters vote in November of 2024.
That's exciting.
We're very excited.
Michael, tell us about your novel approach. I'm sure everyone's on the edge of their seat wanting to hear about this.
Well, we think that November 2024, the election that is coming up in less than 2 years, is a perfect time to ask voters, should we protect voting rights in Oregon's state constitution and grant all eligible voters and all eligible candidates an equal chance in our democracy in publicly funded elections? So we're taking a very simple approach to amend the Constitution, protect voting rights, and give our state legislature the catalyzing action and the flexibility to implement a system that can be designed through a public process. So our language will put voters first, and we're really excited about it. It will create a fully open primary, and it'll be up to the legislature and the folks that want to go and testify and observe and comment on that public process, whether it be a top 2, a top 4, or final 5 voting. And so we're really excited about asking a fundamental question of voting rights and participation in our democracy that we think Oregon voters are going to be really excited to vote yes about.
So, and then I want to go to Steve, but just describe briefly, Michael, what would appear on the ballot? What would people be voting yes or no on?
Sure. A Men's Constitution requires an open primary process in which all candidates and voters compete regardless of political party affiliation. That's kind of the draft caption that we have from our Attorney General, and we think that the language is strong, and we should have approval to circulate this spring, and we have through July of 2024 to collect our signatures. So that gives us maybe a year and a half, a year and maybe a quarter to collect all the signatures that we're going to need to qualify this thing. And it's a really great opportunity to finally bring open primaries to Oregon and build off of our long history of pioneering innovations in direct democracy for our state.
Right, right. So if it passes, the legislature will then have to create the policy that reflects that principle. And that would be a public process. That's fascinating.
Once voters adopt our initiative petition 16, essentially the closed partisan primary will not be constitutional. And they're going to have to take up the task of creating a constitutional system that honors the will of all eligible voters, not just those that are wearing the jerseys.
That's great. Steve, tell us about the Final 5 campaign in Arizona.
No final decision has been made. There is great passion for Final 5. Certainly, but we're still deciding, and we're going to be deciding that sometime in the spring to figure out exactly what approach we want to take.
Okay.
Open primary, 100% in. Then we're going to actually put out polls, do focus groups, and figure out what it is that voters understand about ranked choice voting, about Final Four, about Final Five, and go forward from there. Certainly, there's the effort to go forward with open primary, as I said. One thing, and to let people behind the fourth wall, as it were, when you mentioned before we started, what states have a history of things. I mean, Arizona, about 10 years or so ago, tried top two,
Right.
and it did not go well at that time. And so one might say, well, this is going to be an uphill climb. It certainly will be, because any sort of reform like this has an uphill climb. But the scene of Arizona has evolved to some extent. And I think what people have seen as far as 2020, 2022 has gone, really intrigued by the idea of reform. We still have to figure out what that specific reform is going to look like, because when it comes down to it, John, to make with reform, you want to win. You want to see change happen, because we're at a time where we have to see change happen. We see some of the threats to our traditional institutions. So I don't want to commit one way or the other. We're definitely pushing for reform. We like ranked choice voting. Whether that's Final Four, Final Five remains to be seen.
Got it. So you'll make that decision later in the spring. That's smart. That's smart. A quick follow-up. You mentioned Arizona, and I was part of that campaign back in 2012 and again 2016, where we really weren't able to move forward. And they failed. There's also been efforts in South Dakota, 2016, 2014 in Oregon that have, for top two, that have failed at the ballot. Voters have rejected them. Joe and Michael in particular, is that a problem? Is that an opportunity? What's changed? How do you think about that?
In 2016, I came late to an effort to bring open primaries to South Dakota, but it also was going to remove the labels. So candidates couldn't say I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, which created a lot of baggage for us in terms of allegations that we weren't being transparent. But we did a great job of educating the public about open primaries. And a lot of people said, boy, if you didn't have that transparency issue, I'd be voting for it. So we think the 2016 campaign helped educate voters and heat us up for success this time.
Got it.
So in Oregon, we've asked voters, like you mentioned, John, in 2014, should we adopt the top two system? And I think that Oregon has a long history of third parties in Oregon. And we also like to have choice at the general election. And there are many advocates of ranked choice voting and star voting in Oregon that would like to see preferential voting come to our state. And so I think that the interesting design of our constitutional ballot measure doesn't specify whether it be a top two or a top four or a final five, and it doesn't specify the voting method. So what it does is it creates a really exciting future for Oregon's democracy, for a multi-party future, the third parties that can be present at the general election. And so we feel really good that this is the right way to do reform, and it allows a public process to determine what should be our voting method, how many candidates should appear in the general election, how should candidates be labeled on an open primary ballot. So there's a lot of these questions that, if we designed a statutory approach, it would have to address all of these things, and it might be a little confusing for voters. And so we want to ask voters a nice, simple, easy question that is sort of universally accepted, that we ought to protect voting rights.
A question for Margaret and Steve. Margaret, one of the things I found so inspiring about your work is how innovative or willing you've been to just go out to the people. So you did this campaign where you got a flatbed truck and drove around the state with these billboards, encouraging people to sign a petition to repeal closed primaries. And you've been at the county fair, and I've seen some of the video from the county fair, and it's just wonderful. But tell me, without talking for 5 hours, because I'm sure you have a million stories, share with us how are people responding to that kind of outreach? Because in the past, I'll be honest, 10 years ago, you talk about reforming the primaries and people looked at you like you were from Mars. Like it really there wasn't that much connection. What's the mood on the street right now in Oklahoma?
Well, I think it's just incredible. I feel like sometimes I liken it to you have a lit match and a dry pasture, and I mean, like, I just think the moment has come right now. I can't explain why. I think it's so many things. Technology, the boom of technology and the saturation of media, the national landscape, the inefficacy at the state level, as and frustration with that to solve some long-term, serious problems that matter in everyday lives here. So there's just this mood of wanting something different and frustration. And so I don't know if we're tapping into that or not, but we're kind of like this little weird idea popcorn machine here, and there's really nothing too crazy for us to do here. And we do love talking directly to people. And when we were at the state fair in Tulsa, which is one of the largest state fairs in the country, and there was a line of people
really
down the aisle wanting to sign our petition. These are just average people with their cotton candy and their strollers. I mean, these are just normal people just like us. So it was great. We had fabulous conversations. People are more informed in a lot of ways than you might suspect. That's
great to hear. Steve, a question for you, because Arizona is such in the news. It's one of the
I hadn't noticed him.
Yeah. It's one of the hot spots for kind of the friction between election deniers and election integrity, and certainly it's a state in which independent voters played an outsized role in the midterm elections. How, and maybe it's not, but how is that impacting, shaping your coalitional outreach? Like what is the interaction between your campaign and that overall kind of environment?
Certainly plays into the approach without question. And I think any of us who've been involved in politics, whether on the media side or the actual campaign side, maybe roll our eyes at the phrase big tent, but this is a real opportunity in Arizona to have that true big tent approach, because you're seeing even folks who've been dyed-in-the-wool Republicans see some of the candidates that their party nominated, that they didn't really have a choice in the matter per se because of the impact that the primary can have. If we look at the percentage of actual voters who are affecting who the folks get to decide on the general election, it's this tiny percentage, John. And when we come down to gerrymandering, redistricting, all these approaches, we're in a position where people don't have the opportunity to truly make a free choice. So what we're seeing is that maybe a large group of Republicans would have been opposed, but then they see how in what was supposed to be a Republican year, of course, we all heard about the red wave.
Right.
Democrats won statewide office in very healthy, in some of the races tightly, but the victories were healthy in terms of governor, attorney general, secretary of state, of course, Mark Kelly getting a full term as a U.S. senator as well. It's very exciting to be a part of, because you can see strange bedfellows popping up everywhere. You're going to see, hopefully, Latino groups interested in this. You're going to see young voters interested in this who have less ties to party politics. And you're also going to see some who in the past would say, status quo is working pretty well for me. After what happened in 2022, not so much. So that's really, I think, what we're excited about. This is going to be a big group of people from all walks of life really interested in at least seeing what reform could look like.
Got it. That's great to hear. All right, we have a lot of questions from participants today. I'm going to start it off. Actually, two people had the identical question. Both Kathy Stewart and Blake Sasha had a question for you, Michael, about, do you trust the legislature? So I'm going to let Kathy ask Blake and Kathy's question of you. Go ahead, Kathy.
Hi, John. Hi, everyone. Let me turn my video on here. I'm actually watching today with Harry Kresge, Counsel to Independent Voting, who asked this question as well. So love to hear your thoughts on what happens if the state legislature monkeys with the intent of the initiative. I get the intent, it's very creative. What then?
It's a great question.
Follow through.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the possibility that the legislature fails to conform statute to the new constitutional requirement is a real possibility. And what it does is it gives voting rights advocates and open primaries advocates legal standings to seek a court-ordered remedy to the problem of the legislature protecting the two-party system. And I think that would create an interesting earned media environment in which reporters would be fascinated to understand the mechanisms by which our legislature is not honoring and refusing to create a fair and just system for our elections. And so we think that the legislature will act in good faith. I think we have to have confidence in the public body that is our representative democracy. But if the legislature doesn't act, we could certainly bring a statutory initiative that is similar to the Alaska style model to Oregon. I mean, that's one option, that we could have a concurrent ballot measure environment and ask the voters both questions in 2024, or we could have a subsequent ballot measure with the constitutional coming first in 2024, and then a statutory ballot measure to establish the design of the system by initiative petition if the legislature doesn't want to do it. So.
Great, thanks, Michael. We have a question from Ross Swimmer, who's a prominent attorney in Oklahoma. I presume this is for you, Margaret, but other panelists, please feel free to weigh in. Go ahead, Ross.
I had not asked a question. So
oh, really? Oh, well, you must have gotten it wrong here. All right.
I could probably think of some, but I'm sure Margaret would answer it, even if I hadn't asked it.
No. Sorry, we got our wires crossed. We'll come back to you, Ross. But if you have a question, please feel free to ask one. We're going to go next to Curtis Harrison in Colorado, who has a question about the top two system. So go ahead, Curtis.
Yeah, basically it's just a question on with how many independent voters indicate they want to see new parties and new voices expressed in our political system. How do you deal with concerns that a top two system artificially or unfairly benefits the two establishment parties and prevents those new voices from making it onto the general ballot?
Valid concern. Top two, I don't have a whole bunch of experience in what's happened in California, but I guess that's probably the best experiment that's been run since 2010. I understand there's some really, sometimes you end up with two Republicans in the final, sometimes two Democrats. I don't know about other, I haven't heard how that works.
You know,
if I can jump on there, that was one of the things that having lived in California,
I have some thoughts too. Go ahead.
Having lived in California for just a little while myself, that's one of the things we heard a little bit. I just heard anecdotally when I was a journalist that people said, well, top two is better than the current system we have, but what if you do end up with two Republicans or two Democrats? And that's, in some ways, that's just, for some people, that just goes against their sense of fairness. It's, and Curtis, what you're asking there, not just a sense of fairness of not allowing a third or fourth party, but actually, does it actually cut out the other major party and maybe some other candidates? So John, that was just anecdotal, but that's what I've heard a bit of.
I have two thoughts about that, Curtis, that you might find of interest. One is that one of the myths about American politics is that most elections feature a Democrat versus a Republican. And if you look at the statistics, roughly 50% of legislative races in the United States of America feature one candidate. Okay, so one of the things that a political opportunity for new political parties, and I'm sad to say that the Green Party and the Libertarian Party, unfortunately, are stuck in certain kind of old paradigms. I'm much more optimistic about the Forward Party, is that as a new political organization, there are huge opportunities to get into the top two in states that have a top two system, where you then get to do a head-to-head instead of being the third party that's had to sit out the primary system, which is months and months long. So I actually think the top two system creates huge opportunities for new political organizations, new political parties, but it requires also challenging the notion of what it means to be successful as a new organization. Maybe what you do is you get 10% in the primary And then you enter into a negotiation with the top two candidates and see what you can do in order to build a political base. But anyway, just some thoughts. I don't know if that's helpful to you.
John, is what you're saying, does that involve states that are clearly one party or the other dominant as far as a third party getting in?
Yeah, I think in some ways what I like about the top two, which is not to say I like top two, top three, top four, although Dan Krasner and I joke about this all the time. How come no one's for top three? Where did top three go? I like all these, and they all have pros and cons. I think there is this almost bias that the top two system is intrinsically anti-third party. And I do not think that is true. I think it creates challenges and opportunities. Just as I think the top four and the top five create challenges and opportunities. There is no perfect system. I think the question is, can the third party movement take advantage of nonpartisan systems of every stripe to build their organizations and get their voice out there? I think that's like the mindset to get into. All right. We got to keep things moving here. We're going back to Blake, Sasha, who has another question about the League of Women Voters and other groups. Go ahead, Blake.
Thanks for the opportunity and for all the work. The League of Women Voters did oppose the top two initiative here in Arizona. I believe they were instrumental in opposing it in Florida. And so concerned that, centrist, and I'll use the term centrist groups, are going to be key to a coalition of passing this, and opposition from centrist groups like that could be very difficult to overcome. So curious, Michael specifically, and other folks who are really thinking deeply about top two, are you worried about that, and how do you intend to address it?
My wife and I are members of the League of Women Voters, and so I'm going to be doing my part to get my local chapter on board with our language. But it's a very good question, right? We need to all be rowing together, right? So we need every oar going into the water at the same time if we're going to move our boat upstream. And that's what we were really called to do. And I believe that voting rights, fundamental protections for those, and access to our democracy is central to the mission of the League of Women Voters that was really born out of the progressive movement and the era that saw, a lot of these really great pro-democracy, democracy strengthening electoral systems like direct election of, U.S. senators and the initiative and referendum process, right? And so it's just, I think, continuing to engage with partners and ensuring that they have a seat at the table and that they can be elevated to help and advocate for systems that we all want to realize. I think that's the beauty of the language behind IP16, is that they get a front row seat when the legislature meets to conform our new election system to the constitutional amendment to help design the new system. And I think that that's a really exciting opportunity that shouldn't be something that is opposed, right? So. But I don't know, John, do you have any thoughts on that? I think, we are so lucky to have your leadership and wisdom. Yeah. You bring a lot to the table on this. And I, think there's a lot to be learned from the situation in Florida. I don't know if you've got a crystal ball or the answers, but.
I mean, honestly, I think there's a very fluid situation because a lot of the, I call them legacy political reform organizations. They were formed in prior eras, the Watergate era, the progressive era, they're grappling with this rise of independent voters. It's a new phenomenon. It's a new set of facts on the ground. And the League of Women Voters has not really had to deal with it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 75 years ago. Same with Common Cause. There's organizations that are starting to grapple with this. Sometimes their first instinct is to be like, no, I don't think we should write them off. I think we have to organize them. They'll oppose us and then they'll support us. And Common Cause is a great example. They have opposed open primaries efforts in some states. They've supported it in other states. It's not an even picture. So I think we have to work to engage, all these groups and recognize that our issue, we're the new kids on the block. Don't expect people to support us right out of the gate. They don't understand it. We've got to do the hard work to win them over. All right, if you have a question, go into the chat, type your name, your state, a one-sentence description of your question, and then I'll call on you. So let's keep the questions coming. We've got about 15 more minutes. I'm going to turn now to, let me see here. We're going to go back to Oklahoma. A question from Ken Setter about Oregon. So someone from Oklahoma asking a question about Oregon. So go ahead, Kenneth.
My question is, in the revision of the Constitution that you're envisioning, is it stated that they have to come up with a system so that all voters have access to all candidates in the primaries?
Kenneth, that's a great question. And the answer is yes. All voters can vote among all candidates that have filed to run and have qualified to appear, for that race. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Of course.
All right, we're going to go to Madeline Kando. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. From Massachusetts, has a question about the relationship between primary reform and multi-party democracy. Go ahead.
Yes, I was wondering if an open primary system would eventually lead to a similar situation where there would be a multi-party system like many European countries. Or is that a different animal altogether?
Any thoughts?
Well, Madeline, I certainly think that a multi-party future is much more possible once we create an equal playing field for all candidates from all parties and from no parties, right? So I was just looking at a figure that showed that in 2021, just 33% of voters believed the two existing parties did an adequate job of representing the American people. So, we see that there's momentum behind the Forward Party and behind third parties. And I think a multi-party future within a representative democracy is a really exciting future to think about. So I appreciate that question.
John, could I offer something from Arizona? I think it's, I think there's a possibility, I don't know if this is pie in the sky, but there's a possibility that having an open primary system potentially could cause the current two major parties to upend themselves, inverse what they're doing now, where we're seeing, certainly on the Republican side, a little bit on the Democratic side, but the Republican side, where the leaders, the activists don't necessarily reflect, I shouldn't even say don't necessarily, do not reflect the will of the voters. And there's always discussion here about, well, maybe internally the Republican Party can reform itself. Most people are pretty skeptical about that. Maybe this is a way for the both major parties to realize, hey, there are a lot of other voters we're not reaching that we would love to reach if we actually focused more on problem solving, getting things done, and not just what our platform says. So I'm not so certain it would lead to a third party in Arizona, but might lead to the two parties being more effective and actually listening more to voters.
Yeah, Madeline, one thing I like about it is the uncertainty. We don't know. It's not a reform in which you say we get A and then B will happen. I think to what Michael's point is that if we can departisanize the process, there's lots of new possibilities. One of them might be a multi-party system. One of them might be the two parties getting their act together. It might be some combination of those things. It might be all kinds of non-party actors getting their voice heard more. You see that. I mean, you talk to independent voters, there's a lot of voters out there who say, I don't want to be a Democrat or Republican, but I don't want to be a part of any political party, but I want my voice heard. So I like the possibility aspect of it personally. And it's up to us, the people, to make sure those possibilities, move in a positive direction. All right, we have a question from Liz Ritchie about research. Go ahead, Liz.
Thank you so much. I'm in California, so we have the top two. We have a lot of the different models have been kind of implemented and tested, but I was asking, do you have any background in evaluating the successes of the models that you're wanting to implement? What I've concerned about and what I've seen has been the money people buying candidates. And I just say it like that, where they have an influence on those candidates, and their purpose may not be for the best benefits of their local people or for their state. They are actually for their financial connections and not really looking out for the people. So I love the idea that the people get the vote. What are we doing to protect it? Because it can become so much more than just having the two parties. And I'm not a two-party person. I'm just saying, what do we have as confidence that anything else is better?
Well, I could take a stab at it, but I would love to hear from others too on the panel.
Well,
Margaret,
I
don't know.
I can go ahead and comment that the reason why we believe open primaries is going to result in a positive is really because it's not defensible to have a closed primary system. There's really no democratic basis to support why it's going to result in anything good. Like John said, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we know we're going to have more eligible voters, more people able to participate in primaries. So I'm not afraid of that. I'm not afraid of the voters. It's our country, it's our state, right? So, I think that those that show up and hopefully thoughtfully cast their votes, it's in our hands, good and bad. So there's no guarantee, but we know that a closed primary system is just not okay. It's wrong to exclude people from a democratic process when they're lawfully registered and paying for those elections. So let's remove that barrier, and then we go from there.
Yeah, I've got to agree. I don't think anybody likes what's happening in South Dakota politics. The Republican Party doesn't like it. As our Senate Majority Leader said, the wackadoodles, as he labels them, mounted an insurrection at our state Republican convention and basically threw out the Secretary of State who was running for re-election and almost the Lieutenant Governor as well. The Republicans don't like the results. The Democrats are left out. The Independents are left out. Time for a change, and I think top two is a good fix. Is it perfect? I don't know that there is a perfect system. I'm willing to gamble that, as Margaret, as you say, just opening it up to more voters make a big difference.
Yeah, Liz, I think that your question is a good one, and I think you said that you were in California. And since 2010, I believe, is when your state adopted the fully open primary. And I was reading something that was published that did a study showing that there's been a 5x increase in incumbent accountability via attrition. And so I think that it does allow voters to have more power than the politicians. And putting voters first is always going to be an issue that changes the dynamics in a state, that moves the needle. You mentioned money in politics, and Oregon is one of the last few remaining states that has zero campaign limits. Right? We have no limits on how much money can flow into politics. And I think that there is a corrupting influence of money in politics that has led some politicians to put the, self-interest, demands of special interest ahead of voter concerns and legislating in the true public interest, right? So that we can have broad policy outcomes that create results for everyday, ordinary folks that we're fighting for, right? My mom works in the public sector. My wife has worked in the public sector in our public education system. And I think that there's a high degree of demoralization that's gone on. And I don't think our public sector can deliver the results that we all deserve until we reform the structure of how that public sector is governed. And I think that this is the central question of the day, to move the needle in terms of the outcomes that are downstream of these systems, right? So we all feel the poor results of poor governance, and we are called to change things.
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I love what Michael says, and he relates it to California. So obviously, Oklahoma is in a completely different paradigm than California, Colorado, Oregon, Arizona. We might be kind of like Arizona and South Dakota. I mean, just lots of parallels in our demographics and the economies and things like that. But I can tell you, I would love to have a state that produced both Republicans and Democrats that represented us. Right now, we just don't have that. So when you ask the question and you're from California, I look at you and I think, well, you guys are way further along than we are, you know? So we just need to get to that point where our voters here in this state are fully represented. I think you guys are a step ahead of us. Many of you are. We've been a little bit asleep at the switch here, but we're not now. And I think we're ready. We're ready for something to happen. And we're not really known for patience here, at least in my little neck of the woods. So hopefully we're going to accelerate that process.
Thank you all. That's very wise words. We have a question from Ross Elder in Oklahoma about the quality of candidates in an open system. Go ahead, Ross. You there? You got to take yourself off mute.
There we go. I just wonder how much this would change the types of people that would be willing to run in the first place. What kind of candidates? How would they campaign differently? What would this scenario look like in your judgment in terms of the change being made?
Well, John, do you want to start on that, or do you want me to answer?
Go right ahead, dive in.
Okay. Well, we know that in a lot of counties, even in Oklahoma, there's often just one ballot. There's not there might not be a Democrat primary at all. In a lot of races here, I think the statistic is that 96% of Oklahoma elections are actually determined in our primaries here, and that the others are maybe I have that it's 94%, and 6% are considered non-competitive. So if we have an open system, especially if we went with a nonpartisan system, it would throw everybody on a single ballot in the primaries, and everybody would be able to vote. Now, we could actually have a single primary ballot where you retain the note on your affiliation there, Republican, Democrat, but everybody would be on the same page. It would allow all of those independent voters to come into the process who are currently unable to vote. A lot of voters who don't have a choice at all because of their party registration. And so then you have an open system that's more competitive with policies and ideas instead of a rote kind of, platform. In Oklahoma, we have straight party voting, and 69% of the Republican vote was just a straight party vote in November of 22. We think that if we can mix things up, get everybody on the same footing in the primary system, people are going to be able to compare different candidates and candidates who may not have felt like they had a chance in the past might be more willing to file for office because they know they're going to be on equal footing with everybody else.
To briefly piggyback on what Margaret's saying. I think to address the part of Roz's question about how they would campaign, I think campaigning would change, because maybe the phrase red meat to the base would leave for a while, because there would be less appeal to a candidate to try to appeal to that red meat, because the red meat becomes a broader coalition of people potentially, because more voters, when you know you have to appeal potentially to people who are to your left or to your right, whichever the case may be, you're going to talk to those people differently, and you're going to have to offer, in some ways at least, what my potential solutions would be, as opposed to just preaching to the choir. That's the hope, at least.
Yeah. And John, if I can just add really quickly, in Oregon today, 42% of our electorate are independent of the two-party system, which is a huge number. And we focus on that as the voters. But in that group, those are potential candidates and disproportionately disaffected or disproportionately disenfranchised, both from having a chance to seek office and having a chance to participate in our elections, right? We know that veterans put country before party, and we are so honored at All Oregon Votes to have the support of Veterans for Political Innovation. We believe that they're a very important group, but also too disproportionately disenfranchised as potential candidates. You know, we know that it's lower income voters, Hispanic voters, Asian American voters. We know that naturalized immigrants, right, citizens, new U.S. citizens, right, are disproportionately comprised of that group. So yes, the answer is that this would create a much more robust and vibrant democracy in which candidates from all walks of life feel that they have a chance to and a realistic chance to seek office and to win.
That's a really important point. We've just got 2 minutes. Joe Welp from Alabama had a question about documentation, which, Joe, I'm going to follow up with you after this event and get you what you need. I want to go to Sass from Oregon. They have a question about vote splitting. And then we're going to close it out with a great question from Bill Hurst in Michigan. So go ahead, Sass.
Thank you. Yes. So I'm fully on board with the concept that all voters should be able to vote in all their elections in their jurisdictions. It's a fantastic idea, concept, mechanic. I'm on board. But from a systems engineering perspective, there's a competing mechanical problem in our system, which is vote splitting, right? Which is caused by only being able to support one candidate at a time, right? Which we see both in the choose one voting that we normally use, as well as ranked choice voting. And Alaska demonstrated this in their first election, which speaks to the motivation of why partisan primaries currently exist, right? It's these parties don't want to risk splitting the vote between multiple candidates within their same party. And so when I'm thinking about this open primaries concept, both in the primary and in generals with more than two candidates, we're talking about maybe top 4, top 5, we have this vote splitting mechanic that I think could cause the open primaries model to backfire if we don't also address that issue too. So I was wondering if you could speak to looking at both of these mechanics in tandem, the opening up all the principle of allowing all voters to vote in all elections, and as well as making sure that we don't have the vote splitting problem that can cause that to backfire, and how we marry those two together and the importance of that as well. So just any thoughts you have on that?
Anyone? Mike, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, sure. I think Sass has a really great question, and I'm so glad that you asked it, because it really speaks to the voting method question. And I think that it's a critical conversation that we have as we are looking at the field of electoral reform. And I think that preferential voting is certainly something that can address vote splitting, right, in a real substantive way. And so I think that this should be on our radars, absolutely, and we should be fully supportive as a community that is advancing these policies that truly do empower voters to have more of an ability to influence outcomes of elections beyond the two-party dynamic, which, you know, is able to kind of commandeer our voting systems. So,
got it. Bill, I'm sorry. I know I teed you up, but we're actually out of time. So I want you to.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Bill, I want you to come on next month's call and ask the exact same question because it's really interesting. Thank you, everyone. We could talk for another 2 hours about these efforts. We're going to be sending a follow-up email so you have links to all the campaigns. I'd encourage you to become donors, supporters, advocates, even if you don't live in those states. There's lots of different ways to help. And we're at the very beginning here. And these are just some of the campaigns. There's other efforts in Connecticut, Rhode Island, Arkansas, Nebraska, places, people are working on this issue all over the country. And I'm really want to thank our panelists for taking some time to share a few of their early stage thoughts about what's going on. Thank you. We will be in touch and have a great week.